Final Fantasy VII released back in 1997, and for many, myself included, it changed our mindset towards video gaming forever. I want to begin by giving a quick shout out to all who support my channel, to those who have donated, my YouTube members and my patrons, thank you so much. I guess I should just point out as well that this video was recorded at the start of November 2018, and depending on when you're watching, some of the information I provide here about the remake might be outdated, changed or just no longer relevant. So Final Fantasy VII was the game that radically changed my views of what video gaming is and what it could be. Sure, if you've no experience with the franchise and begin playing the game today in 2018 with its PS1 era graphics and zero voice acting, it's probably not going to evoke the same kind of response in you had you done so back during its initial release. Now, that doesn't mean you won't enjoy the game, and I really hope that you do of course, but the simple fact of the matter is that we can no longer approach a game released, more than 20 years ago I guess in its original given context, since we have, whether we want to admit this to ourselves or not, all now been influenced by modern technologies and means of storytelling. That might seem like a moot point, but Final Fantasy VII has been placed on such a high pedestal that even those who have never played the game for themselves still know of it and of its place in gaming history. You know, I honestly believe that Final Fantasy VII is as important and influential to its genre as Grand Theft Auto 3 was to its genre. It actually helps support the argument that video gaming wasn't just a pastime for children, but was a valid means of entertainment for all ages, whether young, old, or I guess anything in between. For many of us back in the late 90s, we'd simply never explored such a cinematic storytelling gaming experience in a way that Final Fantasy VII was able to provide for us. The characters, well, mostly, the setting of the high-tech crossed with fantasy, the gameplay, the cutscenes, and of course that fantastically amazing, that stunning score by Nobuo Uematsu. The whole of this contributed to an experience that can only really be described, I guess, as, well, memorable and just downright emotional. Final Fantasy VII was just a darn good 90s role-playing video game, and I'm quite sad actually that the experience of going through it for the first time back then is something that can not really be repeated. You see, the legacy of this game is such that Square have announced it to be, so far anyway, the only entry in the entire Final Fantasy franchise to be getting a complete remake treatment. Now, I guess this was a move that even they resisted for a long time, at least, you know, publicly. Despite petitions and calls from fans for a remake, Square persistently told us that they had no plans to develop one.
And we currently have no plans on releasing a remake of Final Fantasy VII.
And I think the reason for this is that they understood that however great a remade version of Final Fantasy VII could be, it's never going to live up to the legacy, the stardom and just the hype generated by the Final Fantasy VII brand itself. And this is why I believe they committed to making new stories from within the Final Fantasy VII universe instead. You know, I'm sure many of you watching are familiar with the Final Fantasy VII compilation. However, for whatever reason, they had a change of heart, and in 2015, Square confirmed that yes, they are indeed working on the very thing that fans had been requesting for such a long time, a fully fledged modern generation remake. Well, it's been 3 years since that announcement, and sadly we haven't received a whole lot of new information about it since. So inevitably, fans have been wondering, how is the game actually going to compare to the original Final Fantasy VII? What's changing? What's staying the same? Well, I scoured the internet and right now we, as I say, only really have tidbits of official information to go on, but there is some intelligent speculation mixed in for good measure. So let's go ahead and have a look at some of the details now. This is Final Fantasy VII versus the remake, what's changing and what's staying the same. And of course there will be spoilers ahead. Okay, so of course, this would be the most obvious point of comparison between the two games. When you think of any modern video game remake, the first thing that's going to come to mind is how the reimagined game now appears. I know that Final Fantasy XV has been a divisive entry into the franchise for various reasons, but regardless of what you think about that game, I don't believe you can say it was a graphical disappointment. That game looks stunning, and it still does today 2 years later. Square have really set the bar high for the graphical standard of Final Fantasy going forward, and I expect the 7 remake to follow in its wake. Now, the original game was the first in the franchise to make the switch into 3D, which in many ways was an experiment for the development and design teams, who were actually initially expecting to work on another Final Fantasy VI style 2D game. The 3D character models were first of their kind for the Final Fantasy team, and they were improved upon during the franchise's life on the PlayStation era alone. For a little nitpicking, there was perhaps an inconsistency that was present throughout the game's use of the 3D character models. Field models were different to the battle models, and even the cinematics flipped between recreations of the field models and a more cinematic style. And this kind of constant switching between model types could at times be a little bit disjointing, and it wasn't present at all in Final Fantasy VIII and IX. However, the move to 3D was overall a great first attempt, and that really worked at adding to the experience. Controlling the lead field character was a simple process that worked well. The backgrounds themselves, i.e. the actual environments that the field activities took place against, were another substantial aspect of the original game's art design. Rather than using polygonal 3D techniques, the backgrounds were basically matte paintings, pre-rendered images that were shown on the screen with various hidden pathing elements that the field characters could then navigate through. For every unique environment found in the game, an artist at some point painted it. In total, there were over 700 individually pre-rendered backgrounds used throughout Final Fantasy VII. And all of this has given the original game a truly unique art design that is simply not going to be replicated by the remake. What we do know about the remake is that the team behind it are focusing less on invoking nostalgia in the player and more on bringing a truly modern looking representation of the game to life. As I'm going to explain later, this is not only the philosophy towards the graphical presentation, but in many other areas of the game's design also. The remake is being developed using Unreal Engine 4, and this is the same game engine that's being used for the upcoming Kingdom Hearts 3. So say goodbye to the pre-rendered backgrounds and low polygon 3D character models of the original game. In their place, we should expect fully interactable, real-time and beautifully rendered environments, and the vastly improved character models that we've seen more recently with games such as Final Fantasy XV. On that point of character models, it will not only be an increase in polygons that differentiates them from each version of the game, the look of at least some of the characters has apparently also been redesigned. During the Fairfell Stories exhibition in Tokyo, which took place earlier this year, Square revealed 4 new screenshots which showed Cloud, Biggs, Wedge and Jessie. Sadly, those images were not made public, but according to the Twitter reactions of those who were present, the characters have now undergone actual design changes. They are looking somewhat different even when compared to how they appeared in earlier screenshots we've seen of the remake. As to why these new designs have not been made public yet, I don't know. Maybe Square were just testing the reactions through a limited reveal, and we'll just have to wait and see how the final versions of the characters are going to look. I would also like to note that the character models themselves are being supervised by Visual Works, and this is the same team behind many of the CGI scenes from the previous Final Fantasy games, Advent Children and King's Glaive. While I'm really excited about seeing Final Fantasy VII with this new lease of life, I also humbly suggest there are several iconic moments of the game that should not be interfered with. Recreate those scenes using the new graphical technologies, but keep the essence of them the same. We saw an example of this with Advent Children, where the game's post-credit scene of Red 13 running to the destroyed Midgar was remade using the movie CGI, but the scene itself remained identical and it worked really well. This doesn't mean that every part of the original game must be copied frame by frame, but some scenes have now become so iconic that I do think they need to be preserved in some meaningful way. The dialogue in Final Fantasy VII is mostly presented to the player through vivid blue chat boxes, printed closely to the character that is speaking. It was effective, and despite some poor translational issues, did the job fine. The lack of any kind of voice acting was somewhat notable, however, even during its time. Reviewers in '97 picked up on this fact and would generally defend it as the developer's choice to use players' imaginations instead. Personally, I've never been convinced that the game's lack of audible voicing was down to that kind of reasoning. It seems more likely to me that Final Fantasy VII was simply such a huge project as it was, that it was unfeasible to dedicate the amount of extra resources that would be required for this. Also, the game itself already covered 3 discs on PlayStation and 4 on PC. Having hundreds, if not thousands of lines of voice recorded dialogue would have presented a huge technical challenge in those days. The remake doesn't have these technical limitations, and it has been confirmed beyond any shadow of a doubt that the game will be fully voice acted, as we would expect. When you imagine the main character speaking, you may be inclined to hear the voices as they were realised in the sequel movie Advent Children. Fortunately, Square are working on bringing back as many of the voice actors from that movie to reprise their roles in the remake. Steve Burton, for example, who voiced Cloud Strife in Advent Children, did confirm on Twitter last year that he will be returning to the role of Cloud for the remake. Now, the script itself will not be taken verbatim from the original game. That may be an obvious point, but it is worth making, since while the dialogue was fine in those blue boxes, it just couldn't be taken seriously when voiced. However, Katsushige Nojima, probably mispronounced his name there, was the original writer of Final Fantasy VII and has returned to write the remake also. Nojima is consistently listed in the top video game writers of all time, and we can trust the game is in good hands with him at the helm. Although he's also the man who decided the fate of our beloved Ares. Not sure how we can forgive him for that one. One of the most iconic aspects of Final Fantasy VII is the stunning musical arrangements composed by the talented Nobuo Uematsu. From the memorable themes of Ares and Tifa to the atmospheric tunes of Sephiroth, the game's score is arguably one of the best of all time and is clearly a substantial contributing factor to Final Fantasy VII's prolonged success. In fact, please do let us know in the comments what your favourite tracks are from the game, or hit the like button on another person's comment if they've already shared your opinion. Not a whole lot of information has been given regarding the music of the remake, however what we do know is that Uematsu has been confirmed to return to work on the project. Although technically not stated officially, I think it's safe a bet as any at this point that the soundtrack will be heavily based on the original score. It is inevitable, of course, that the original Final Fantasy VII tracks will be remixed and orchestrated to ensure that they are of the same quality as the rest of the game. What we do not know is whether there will also be new compositions present, and if so, how much blending there will be of the new with the old. What are your opinions on this? Would you like to hear completely new pieces composed by the talented Uematsu, or would this be stretching the boundaries of a remake type project? Personally, I would like the original score to be frontline and centre, even though it will certainly be spruced up. And then perhaps new musical themes can be introduced, but limited to any characters or subplots that are fleshed out more than they were present in the original game. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. I don't think there's really a whole lot more I can say about this. The music of Final Fantasy VII is really just that incredible, and Square would have to work really hard to actually mess it up in the remake. An issue that Square has been relatively quiet on so far, but one that the fans have wondered about, is how the story and characters are going to be presented in the remake. I will provide some official information about this a little later, but first let's just discuss the topic itself. Since the original game's release in 1997, there have been multiple forms of media as part of the Final Fantasy VII compilation. These various projects have taken the form of sequels, prequels, and the further development of popular characters that had limited screen time in the original game. So we inevitably ask the question, with all of that hindsight we now have of those characters and story, how much of it will be seamlessly integrated back into the remake? Indeed, I think a prior question to that is how much of this should be included in the remake. But I think the most fundamental question that must first be addressed is, what is a remake anyway? Over the last few years, Square have been re-releasing some of the previous Final Fantasy games under a remastered label. And we've seen this with Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X and X-2, and more recently Final Fantasy XII. I find it interesting to note that although Square have consistently referred to these re-releases as remastered editions of the originals, occasionally reviewers and internet users have dubbed them as remakes. Each of these games introduces some new features that were not part of the original releases. For example, Final Fantasy IX had in-game cheats that were integrated into the menu system, Final Fantasy X introduced widescreen support, a remastered soundtrack, and 12 also introduced new gameplay elements through an update of the progression system. Of course, with all of these releases, the cinematics and character models were upscaled and improved also. However, they were still the same games. The original games and their respective code were taken and tweaked, but they were not rebuilt from the ground up. When Square announced that one of their older games will be seeing a remastered release, this is the kind of thing we can know that they are talking about. But the upcoming Final Fantasy VII project is a remake, not a remaster. Sure, I guess that word remake can be defined by various contexts, but in this case we need to understand how Square themselves are using the term. The entire game is being built from the ground up. Every line of code will be new, every asset created from scratch. It will be a whole new game. As such, we mustn't assume it will be following the same rules that the previous remasters have established. Square can take much more liberty in how they approach the story and the characters. They can also further develop previous plot lines that were relatively neglected in the original game. An example that comes to mind immediately involves Vincent Valentine. Vincent was always one of my favourite characters in Final Fantasy VII, and I enjoyed what little screen time story he had. However, due to the development's stretching budget and time constraints, he was almost completely cut from the final product. Fortunately, Square decided to keep what they'd already designed and wrote for him, and retained him as an optional character the player could recruit, albeit their plans for Vincent were much greater than what the game eventually presented to us. So even though he was still a wonderful character for the player to explore, his presence also felt a little disjointed at times, and this is just one area the remake could respectfully improve upon. It could also involve characters that weren't introduced into the Final Fantasy VII universe until later projects. Perhaps not in a major way, but a mention of a cameo here or there. It could just help connect the whole franchise together in a more meaningful way. I would submit to you that Square can do these things while still honouring the legacy of the original game. Iconic scenes, story points and characters need not be affected in any way by a fleshing out of the overall experience. As for Square's philosophy towards this topic, one of the remake's directors, Tetsuya Nomura, when discussing why the original Final Fantasy VII writer was brought onto the team, said the following, translated and quoted in English: "I can't go into details, but this is not a simple remake. Let's say for argument's sake that we only pretty up the graphics for current gen hardware. I don't think that would surpass the original version." And he later goes on to say, "Since we now formally revealed Katsushige Nojima's name for the scenario, there will be more plot devices in the story, so I think you can also look forward to that." That's about the only official information I can find on this topic, but it seems clear that the original game story is going to be expanded to some degree for the remake. But I defer to my viewers at this point. How much change is too much change? Since this is a remake, should Square have free reign over introducing new character and plot elements, or could that undermine the legacy of Final Fantasy VII in some way? I suspect there would be a variety of opinions on the right way to go here, so please do share your thoughts on this point. Not only did Final Fantasy VII have such great characters and story, it also brought back an interesting take on Final Fantasy VI's battle system, which was called the ATB, or the Active Time Battle. For battles in Final Fantasy VII, both enemies and player-controlled characters could only act once their individual special charge gauge, known as the ATB bar, had filled. The ATB is a kind of turn-based battle system, but with the charge gauge giving the impression of a more fluid encounter. Players could decrease the time it took for a character's ATB bar to fill by increasing their stats or through temporary spell buffs, and those characters could then take more turns. Of course, some of the game's tougher encounters also involved enemies with faster filling gauges, providing for an interesting mechanic that players had to adapt to. The ATB system proved popular with fans at the time, and variants of it were actually kept throughout the PlayStation 1 era of the franchise, and even Final Fantasy XII and XIII retained some aspects of it. However, Square has gradually moved away from this kind of battle system, and with Final Fantasy XV, it has been completely discarded into the dustbin of concepts that belong in a bygone period. So where does this leave the remake? I'm sure that Square must have battled, no pun intended there, with this issue early on. On the one hand, it cannot be denied that the ATB battles were an integral part of Final Fantasy VII's gameplay. Not having them in the upcoming remake may seem like a mistake to many of the older fans. On the other hand, whether this pleases you or not, the Final Fantasy franchise has moved away from this form of gameplay towards a more action-oriented set of systems. How is Square going to resolve this conflict of old versus new? It's one thing having a new battle system for Final Fantasy XV, since it's a new brand with a new story and new characters, but that isn't the case with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which has to attract a new audience as well as satisfying older fans. Well, I think whatever decisions they made about this was going to annoy someone, but obviously they still had to do something. It seems for the most part, in the context of the battle system, Square have decided on ditching the old in favour of the new. The remake will not involve any kind of turn-based combat or an ATB, and will instead be more action oriented. It will certainly involve aspects of the original game, and player strategy will play a large part, i.e. it won't just involve mashing buttons. Although the combat will be action based, Square has also confirmed that the pace of combat will be somewhat slower than what is seen in Kingdom Hearts. Overall, I really enjoyed playing through Final Fantasy XV, but the battle system in that game was perhaps my least favourite aspect of it. For me personally, battles in Final Fantasy XV often felt clunky, and at times frustrating, and I'm concerned that the Final Fantasy VII Remake could end up like that. That said, I suspect even Square, if being honest, would admit that there are lessons to learn from 15, so I'm certainly going to hold out hope that they're going to get things right this time around. As a side note, it's best not to draw any conclusions about the battle system from the various older screenshots and videos that were released, as Square has stated those menus were placeholders and would not appear in the final product in that form. As important and central as an enjoyable and addictive battle system is to any Final Fantasy game, it's far from the only aspect of gameplay present in number 7. The game offered tons of side quests and mini-games for the player to engage with. Some of these had mandatory tutorials that were required to advance the story, but overall these were optional pieces of content the player could choose to enjoy or ignore completely. Of course, everybody has their own views on the various mini-games and side quests within Final Fantasy VII, and I do think that some work better than others. Perhaps one of the most substantial pieces of optional content was the ability to breed, feed and race your own gold chocobo. Completing this mammoth task would allow the player to traverse the world map landscape without any boundaries and gain access to locations and rewards that were not available by any other means. In terms of the remake, what is the philosophy of the design and development team in the context of these kinds of side quests and minigames? We have very little to go on in terms of strict official information regarding this subject. Kitazi has previously mentioned that the popular minigames from Final Fantasy VII will be included in the remake, but Tetsuya Nomura has also commented that fans should not expect all the minigames that Final Fantasy VII originally brought us. Despite the fact official information is scarce, we can at least be confident that yes, the remake will include at least the more substantial, optional content from the PlayStation game. I would be very surprised if the Chocobo side quests were not implemented in some form, and I think it would be a given that the Gold Saucer will play a substantial role in the remake. However, this still leaves us wondering about some of the optional story content of Final Fantasy VII. I've already spoken about Vincent and how you can literally play through the entire game and ignore everything about him completely. A similar situation resolves around Yuffie and the people of Wutai. If you do not recruit her into your party in time, you will miss out on a large side quest involving her village, which includes story development regarding Shinra and extra boss fights. Will this content be included as optional content when playing the remake, or will it be part of the main story? Will Yuffie and Vincent be optional characters, or have they become too integral to the lore at this point? Could there be other optional characters that we could not recruit in the original game? Will there be new side quests and content to complete? I strongly suspect that there will be, and I'll explain why in the next section. Final Fantasy VII was a beefy game for a 1997 release. The main story, when rushing through, could be completed relatively quickly. However, when focusing on all the optional content the game had to offer, the clock could easily reach 60 hours plus. For my first playthrough, I actually remember the clock getting stuck at 99 hours. I guess the developers just never anticipated players devoted that much time to their game, but we did. PlayStation 1 games were released on CD-ROM, and whereas most of the console's library would each fit onto a single disc, Final Fantasy VII required 3. The main reason for this was the inclusion of the cinematic CGI cutscenes, which required a substantial amount of disk space. Final Fantasy VII was big budget, all singing and all dancing JRPG. It truly became a flagship moment for the franchise. We know with certainty because they've told us that one of the reasons for Square's initial reluctance to commit to developing a remake was a recognition of just how many resources would have to be committed to bringing the project to life, but doing so in a way that brings justice to the original. About 3 years ago, not too long after the remake's announcement, a new press release revealed that the project would be a multi-part series as opposed to a single project. Immediate reception to this announcement was not positive, and fans were worried about what this meant for the game. Square later clarified this fact by arguing that the decision for a multi-part series was made solely to ensure the legacy of the original game could be protected. It would simply not be feasible, they claimed, for a remake of Final Fantasy VII to be contained within one game. During an interview with Game Informer, Kitase spoke a little more about this by comparing the project to Final Fantasy XIII. He wanted to make clear that they are not simply developing the remake as one game that would be split over several episodes. He noted that this was what the fans had assumed from the news of it being multi-part, but it wasn't the reality. Rather, each part would be a full and complete game in and of itself. He said, and I quote, "When the project was first announced, people were confused by its multi-part nature, but the goal is to structure it more like Final Fantasy XIII than an episodic series." He went on to clarify this point. It will essentially be a full-scale game for each part of the multi-part series. In 13, each installment told the story from a different angle. It was kind of like approaching an unknown territory, in a sense. End quote. For those who played through the Final Fantasy XIII franchise, you can probably understand Kitase's point here. Each of the 3 main entries in that series were a full game unto themselves. They each had their own central story, their own purpose, their own gameplay systems, and their own means of player progression. This is the same philosophy they will be bringing to the 7 remake. However, although the Final Fantasy XIII games each shared the characters and overall story, each game contained its own individual narrative. I wonder how this same concept can be used for the story of Final Fantasy VII when the narrative was originally designed for a single game. The original Final Fantasy XIII, for example, had a beginning, a middle and an end. This won't be the case with the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, or will it? How many liberties will be taken with the original story to get everything to fit neatly together? While these questions do not currently have answers, what we do know is that the Final Fantasy VII Remake will be a humongous project and will remain a major part of Square's commitments for many years after its release. Do you agree with a multi-part release for Final Fantasy VII Remake? How do you think this will influence the overall design and flow from the player's perspective? What about aspects such as the world map, and will these work in a multi-part release? I would love to hear your theories and thoughts about these kinds of issues. And speaking of the world map, one aspect of old school Japanese role-playing games that more modern games have chosen not to embrace is the world map feature. This used to be a staple of the Final Fantasy franchise right from the very beginning, but from Final Fantasy X it suddenly disappeared. Nowadays, fast travel and open world gameplay have made the concept of requiring a world map virtually redundant. For me, this is a shame, since the world map was one of those fundamental features that helped identify the JRPG genre. Not the only thing, of course, but one that I thought was important. Final Fantasy VII had a typical world map. It was nothing special compared to those that could be found in other games of its genre, but it still had an important role to play. I have mentioned already about how players could breed their own chocobos, and this is one area where the world map in Final Fantasy VII excelled. As players bred stronger chocobos, they could be used to traverse the landscapes to discover hidden and powerful rewards. The world map made vehicles relevant. At first, the player would gain access to the buggy and be able to cross shallow waters and rivers before earning the tiny Bronco and eventually the high-winged airship. This feeling of progression was only available thanks to the presence of the world map. Where does this feature stand in terms of the modern remake? Although we do not have any specifics right now, the last official info that we had on this topic from Nomura and Kitase is that the remake would likely include some form of open world map. However, if certain internet rumours are to be taken seriously, then the first game of the multi-part remake would only cover the events that take place across Midgar. This was the opening few hours of the original game before the world map was unlocked for the player. If the first game does resolve around Midgar, then how would a world map be necessary? Or would a world map only be included in later entries of the series? or if the entire first game took place in Midgard, does this mean the city is being expanded to the point where its own type of world map would become necessary? I guess time will tell here, but the fact that the remake will involve some use of a world map is something I look forward to learning more about. I know a lot of people are wondering, it's been 3 years since the remake was announced, when and how do we get to play? Unfortunately, it seems the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake is still some time away. Many were expecting Square to tease some new information about the project earlier this year at E3, instead it was never even mentioned. This fact alone has cast a downer on the expectation of a release announcement anytime soon. Square have previously stated that they intentionally decided to announce the remake earlier than they would with their other projects. Now, this may be a rumour, I've not been able to verify this as factual, but several high-profile websites have claimed that in a behind-doors conversation, Kitase suggested the remake would not be released until 2023. Since we can't verify the tone or context of this conversation, this release window may have been a joke, hyperbole, or a realistic release window. Sadly, we simply do not know at this point, but I would advise that you temper your expectations for any kind of imminent announcement, as it's likely any news is still a ways off. When the remake was announced, it was slated for a PS4 release first. This likely means that Xbox One and maybe PC can expect the remake at a later point in time. Although, if the game is not due to come out for another 5 years or so, I suspect this may change as the current generation is surely likely to have passed by that point. For all we know, the Final Fantasy VII Remake may not make its appearance until the next generation of consoles. There we have it, folks. Thank you very much for joining me as we compared the original Final Fantasy VII with the upcoming remake. I hope you enjoyed your time here today. Please let me know in the comments what you would like to see next, and if enough people agree with you, I will make it the focus of a future video. Please remember you can support my work on Patreon, or by signing up as a member of my YouTube channel. Even if you do not wish to support me in this way, please do subscribe to my channel, hit that bell notification, and stay tuned for future Final Fantasy content. Thanks everyone, have a great day, and I will see you next time.